They say the hardest part of losing someone isn't the day they leave. It's the mornings that follow, when the world moves on and you're left behind, staring at their empty chair like it might still hold warmth. That was me. My name is Grace. I turned 56 this spring, here in a small town in North Carolina where the air smells like pine and time moves a little slower than it should. The day after my brother's funeral, I walked through his house alone. It was a gray, quiet morning, the kind where even the birds seemed to hold their breath. I thought I was ready for it, ready to face the echoes, the photographs, the old shirts still hanging in his closet. But grief has a strange way of sneaking up on you. It doesn't crash in like a storm. It seeps into the corners, sits in the air, lingers in the dust. Before we move forward, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Okay, let me tell you that Elliot was my only brother. 2 years older, louder, wilder. When we were kids, he used to climb onto the barn roof and dare me to jump into the hay pile below. I always did. He used to say I was the only one who ever believed he could fly. But somewhere along the way, we stopped being close. Life pulled us in different directions. He left for the city, and I stayed here. I married once, divorced quietly, and poured the rest of my years into the library. He sent postcards for a while, little glimpses of places I'd never been. Oregon, Montana, Maine. Then one day, they stopped coming. And now, there I was, standing in his study, with a garbage bag in one hand and his whole life spread out in front of me. It's strange how ordinary things can hurt. A half-empty coffee mug, a folded sweater, a pen with teeth marks on the cap. Every little thing whispered something about the man I thought I knew. I was sorting through his desk drawers when I found it. A small leather-bound notebook, brown and cracked at the edges, tied shut with a black string. It looked old, like it had been opened and closed 1,000 times. I knew right away it was his. For a minute, I just held it. My first thought was to leave it alone. Elliot was private. He'd always been that way, guarding his thoughts like they were something sacred. But something about the weight of it in my hands made me pause. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity. I don't know, but I untied that string anyway. The first page was dated 10 years ago. The handwriting, sharp, slanted, familiar. It said, "If anyone ever finds this, I hope they'll understand that silence was never cowardice. It was love in disguise." I remember my heart dropping. Those words, they didn't sound like my brother. Or maybe they did, and I just never listened closely enough to know. I turned the page. In it, he wrote, "I wanted to tell her the truth so many times, but the truth doesn't heal. It only breaks." I sat there for a long while, staring at the ink like it might rearrange itself into something that made sense. Who was he writing about? Another page. It said, "The secret has lived with me longer than I'd lived with peace. And now, as I feel time thinning around me, I know I've failed both of them, her and the child, the child." Those two words hit harder than anything. My brother never had children. At least, that's what I'd always believed. I closed the notebook for a moment, pressing my palms against it. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, each sound sharper than the last. I felt like I was intruding on something sacred, something forbidden. But I couldn't stop. I kept reading, my hands trembling. Here he wrote, "If Grace ever finds this, tell her I tried to be brave. Tell her I loved her for staying when I couldn't. But I need her to know, my bloodline didn't end with me." I read that line 3 times before it sank in. My bloodline didn't end with me. I dropped the diary onto the desk and stepped back, as if the words themselves might burn. For years, I'd thought I knew who Elliot was. I thought his distance meant indifference. Now I wondered if it meant something else, something heavier. The air in that room changed after that. I could feel it. Every drawer, every box, every photograph suddenly felt like a clue. That diary, his voice, his confession, was just the beginning. And somehow, deep down, I knew that once I read the rest, I wouldn't see him, or myself, the same way again. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the diary on the table beside me, like it was alive, like it might start whispering if I took my eyes off it. When the sun came up, I made myself a cup of coffee and opened it again. The pages were filled with scattered thoughts. No order, no structure, just emotion bleeding through ink. He'd written about regrets that never faded, about mistakes he couldn't name, about a love that had to stay hidden. There he wrote, "Time doesn't forgive." He wrote, "It just covers old wounds with dust." I didn't feel peaceful reading that. I felt angry. Angry that he'd lived a whole life I didn't know about. Angry that he hadn't trusted me enough to tell me what was breaking him. But beneath that anger was something else, sorrow. The kind that seeps deep and doesn't let go. And then I saw it, the name. It was tucked in the middle of a page, written softly, like he was afraid of the sound it might make. He wrote, "I saw Lydia again today. She doesn't know who I am. She thinks I'm just a friend of her mother's. But when she smiles, I see everything I lost. Lydia." The name struck something deep in me. I remembered a girl, maybe 12, 13, who used to come into the library with her mother years ago. Quiet, polite, always reading stories about oceans and faraway places. Her mother's name was Claire. They'd moved away suddenly, and I never heard from them again. I kept reading. Here he wrote, "She turned 13 today. I sent her a book, anonymously, of course. Couldn't resist." My hands started shaking. I flipped the page and read, "It's strange, watching your own child grow up from a distance. But sometimes, love means staying invisible." I stopped breathing. He said, "Your own child." The coffee on the table had gone cold. I just sat there, staring at those words, realizing that everything I thought I knew about my brother was wrong. He had a daughter no one knew about. And the part that hurt the most wasn't that he'd kept it secret. It was that he'd loved her anyway, quietly, from the shadows, all his life. I turned the last page he'd written on. There, in uneven handwriting, were the words that would start everything that came next. He said, "If Grace ever finds this, tell her to start with Lydia's mother. She knows everything." I closed the diary slowly. My reflection in the window looked like someone else, older, smaller, uncertain. I whispered, "Elliot, what did you do?" And in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever truth my brother had carried to his grave, I was about to dig it up. Because secrets don't die just because the people who kept them do. And his was waiting for me to find it. After I read that line, "Start with Lydia's mother," I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there in that dim light, staring at the page, my heart beating in my throat. Claire. I hadn't thought of her in years. She'd been part of our small town world once, graceful, soft-spoken, with the kind of smile that made people feel safe. When I was in my 20s, she worked at the local diner. I remember Elliot spending more and more time there. I'd tease him about it. Back then, he'd blush, which was rare for him, and say nothing. I should have known. No, I did. By afternoon, I couldn't stand the silence anymore. I picked up the phone and searched for her name. She wasn't hard to find, still living one county over. I hesitated before dialing, my hand trembling. What exactly was I supposed to say? "Hi, Claire. I'm Grace, Elliot's sister. And by the way, did you have his child?" I almost hung up, but curiosity pushes through fear. like it always does when you know you're standing on the edge of something irreversible. When she answered, her voice was older but unmistakable. "Hello? Claire?" I said softly. It's Grace, Elliot's sister." There was a pause, a long one, then a small intake of breath. "Oh," she whispered. "Grace." I could hear the years in her tone, the memories, the weight of something unspoken. "I don't mean to intrude," I said, my throat tight. I was going through Elliot's things, and I found something that, well, it mentioned you and Lydia. The silence on the other end deepened. Finally, Claire said, "I wondered if this day would ever come." We met the next morning at a small cafe near the highway. She looked older, of course, silver streaks in her hair, lines around her eyes, but there was still that same gentleness about her. She smiled when she saw me, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for coming," I said as we sat down. She nodded, stirring her coffee, not looking up. "He kept it all these years, didn't he? The secret." My stomach turned. So it's true. Her hands trembled as she set the spoon down. "Yes, Lydia, she's his." The words hit like thunder. Even though I'd already suspected it, hearing it out loud changed everything. Claire sighed. "It was a long time ago. I was married back then, unhappily. Elliot came along when I needed someone to remind me I was still alive. We were careful, or so we thought. When I found out I was pregnant, I panicked. My husband, he never knew. Elliot wanted to tell the truth, but I begged him not to. It would have destroyed my family, and he loved me enough to disappear." She looked out the window, eyes glistening. "He promised he'd never interfere. And he didn't, not once. But I know he watched her grow from afar. He'd send her birthday gifts sometimes, books usually. He told me once he thought she might grow up to be like your mother, quiet but full of fire." I couldn't speak. My throat ached, my chest tight. "So all these years," I said finally, "he lived with that?" She nodded. "It broke him, Grace. He carried it like penance. He thought staying silent was the only way to protect us, but it ate him alive." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I just stared at my coffee, watching the cream swirl like smoke. Then Claire reached into her bag and pulled out something small, an old photograph. It was of Elliot, younger, standing by a tree, smiling. A little girl stood in front of him, maybe 3 years old, holding a toy rabbit. He was looking at her, not the camera. The kind of look you can't fake. "That was taken at a church picnic," Claire said softly. "He asked me if he could hold her for a minute. I think that was the happiest I ever saw him." I ran my thumb over the photo. Elliot's expression, that tender, almost reverent look, made my eyes burn. When I looked back up, Claire was crying quietly. "He loved her so much," she whispered. "But love like that, it comes with a cost." We sat there for a while, two women bound by the same man's secret, the same grief. I didn't judge her. How could I? Life is messy. Love even more so. Before we parted, she touched my hand. "Please don't tell Lydia," she said. "She's built her life without that truth. Don't take that from her." I nodded, though my heart twisted inside me. I promised her I wouldn't, at least not yet. But deep down, I knew promises like that rarely hold. Because now that I knew the truth, I couldn't unknow it. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw that little girl's face, the one I used to see at the library. And I heard Elliot's words echoing from the diary. My bloodline didn't end with me. He'd written it for me to find. And now I had. But what I did next, that was on me. And it would change everything. After meeting Claire, I thought I'd made peace with the truth, that I'd learned everything I needed to know. But the thing about truth is, it doesn't sit quietly once it's uncovered. It keeps knocking. It keeps asking to be seen fully. That night, I went back to Elliot's house one more time. The sun had set, and the crickets were singing outside like nothing in the world had changed. Inside, though, everything had. I sat at his desk again, the diary open, pages fluttering in the faint breeze from the window. I started from the beginning this time, reading slowly, letting every word sink in. He'd written about that year, the year he disappeared, the one we all thought he'd spent traveling for work. But now, I saw it differently. That year wasn't an escape, he wrote. It was an exile. I was living in the same town as her, but I couldn't see her, couldn't touch her. Claire said it was safer that way. I thought I could handle it. I was wrong. As I read, I could feel his loneliness. It poured out of every sentence. The longing, the guilt, the quiet devotion of a man trying to do the right thing while breaking inside. He wrote about walking past the park where Lydia played, watching from his car as she chased bubbles across the grass. He described her laugh, a sound that fixes everything and ruins you at the same time. He wrote about birthdays missed, about nights he sat alone in motels, whispering her name like a prayer. And near the end, he wrote something that made me close the book and hold it to my chest. He said, "Sometimes love isn't about being seen. It's about staying invisible so others can live freely." I don't know how long I sat there, crying. Long enough for the stars to come out. Long enough for the night to turn to silence. That's when I saw the envelope tucked behind the back cover. My heart jumped. I pulled it out carefully. Inside was a single photograph, the same one Claire had shown me at the cafe, and a folded piece of paper. On it, in Elliot's handwriting, were the words, "If she ever asks, tell her I was there. Tell her I never stopped loving her, even when I wasn't allowed to show it." My hands shook. For the first time in years, I whispered his name out loud. "Elliot, you fool," I said, half smiling through tears. "You loved too much and spoke too little." I decided then that I needed to see Lydia. Not to confess everything, not yet, but to see her with my own eyes, the child my brother had loved in silence. I found her easily. The internet makes ghosts easy to trace. She was 33 now, living in Atlanta, working as a teacher, married, 2 kids. She looked happy, whole. I stared at her photo on the screen, that same shy smile, that same quiet grace. I felt a pull in my chest, like I'd known her my whole life. Maybe in some strange way, I had. I told myself I'd just send her a message, something small. Maybe about her mother, maybe about old times. But when I started typing, the words refused to come. How do you tell someone their father wasn't who they thought he was? How do you honor a secret that's already taken 2 lives and might destroy a third? I closed the laptop and sat there in the dark, my hand on the diary. I thought of Elliot's silence, how heavy it must have been, and for the first time, I understood why he never said a word. Because love, when it's real, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quietest thing in the world. But I also knew one more thing. Secrets don't stay buried forever. And whether I liked it or not, this one was rising to the surface, with or without my permission. I told myself I wouldn't do it, that I'd leave the secret where it belonged, in the quiet, with him. But the more I tried to move on, the louder it became. Every morning, I'd make coffee and tell myself not to think about it. And every morning, I'd catch sight of the diary on my table, that small brown book sitting there like an open wound. By the 4th day, I gave up pretending. I needed to hear her voice. I found Lydia's number easily. Her school listed it publicly. My hands shook as I dialed. I almost hung up twice before she answered. Hello? Her voice was calm, kind, the kind of tone teachers have when they're used to making the world sound safe. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Hi, I'm sorry to call out of the blue, I said, my voice unsteady. My name is Grace. I think you used to know my brother, Elliot. There was a pause, soft but heavy. Elliot, she repeated. Yes, I remember him. He was a friend of my mom's, right? He used to give me books when I was little. I smiled faintly, though she couldn't see it. Yes, that sounds like him. Something in her voice, warm but cautious, reminded me of him. The way she spoke slowly, choosing her words. I'm sorry to bother you, I said. I found something of his after he passed. I think you might want to hear it. Oh, she said softly. I didn't know he'd passed. I'm sorry. He was always so kind to me. Kind, that word caught in my throat. She had no idea what that kindness had cost him. I took a deep breath. Would you be open to meeting me sometime? There's something important I think you should know. She hesitated, then agreed. We met 2 days later in a quiet park just outside the city. She was waiting for me on a bench beneath an old oak tree, sunlight flickering through the leaves. When she turned, my breath caught. I could see him in her, the same eyes, that same stillness that Elliot always carried like armor. Grace, she said, standing to greet me. It's nice to meet you. I smiled, though my heart was pounding. You too. We sat. I didn't know where to begin. The words felt too heavy for the air around us. So I started with the simplest truth. My brother cared about you, I said. More than you probably realized. She smiled faintly. He was always around when I was little. I used to think he was some sort of guardian angel. Then one day, he just stopped coming. Her voice cracked a little. I never knew why. I swallowed hard. He didn't stop because he wanted to. She looked at me, confusion flickering across her face. I reached into my bag and pulled out the diary. After he died, I found this. I read it, and I think it's time you knew who he really was. Her hands trembled as she took the book. She opened it slowly, reading the first few lines. Her lips parted as she recognized his handwriting. For a long while, she just read silently. Then she stopped, her eyes wide. She looked up at me, tears already forming. This isn't real. I'm afraid it is. She pressed her hand to her mouth, shaking her head. He was my father? Her voice cracked on the word. I nodded, tears burning behind my eyes. He was. He never stopped loving you, Lydia. He just wasn't allowed to show it. She looked away, tears spilling freely now. All those birthdays, she whispered. The books, the cards without names. I always wondered. Her grief wasn't loud. It was quiet, trembling, like a child trying not to cry. I should have known, she said softly. He looked at me differently. I used to feel safe when he was around, like he saw me, really saw me. She looked up again, her eyes raw. Why didn't he tell me? Because he thought silence would protect you, I said. He didn't want to hurt your family or your mother. He thought he was doing the right thing. She nodded slowly, wiping her cheeks. That sounds like him. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, two strangers tied together by one man's secret. Finally, she closed the diary and held it against her chest. Thank you for telling me, she said softly. It hurts, but I'm glad to finally know who I am. We hugged, awkwardly at first, then tightly, like something long divided was finally whole again. Before she left, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small photo, the same one Claire and I had seen. I've had this for years, she said. I never knew why Mom kept it. I guess now I do. She pressed it into my hands. You should have it. He'd want you to. I looked down at that image, Elliot smiling, holding her as a toddler, and I swear, for a moment, it felt like the world stopped spinning. She smiled through her tears. He really did love me, didn't he? I nodded. More than you'll ever know. As she walked away, I stood there beneath the oak tree, the photograph trembling in my hand. I realized then that truth doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it sets love free. And for the first time since Elliot died, I felt like he was at peace. But I was wrong. There was still one more truth waiting for me, hidden in the photograph she'd just given back. And when I saw it, everything I thought I understood shifted again. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the photograph laid out in front of me. The house was quiet, except for the sound of rain against the windows. I traced my finger over Elliot's face, that familiar, gentle smile. And then I noticed it. In the bottom corner, faint but visible, were initials, E.H., and a date, written in my mother's handwriting. ... I frowned. My mother passed away nearly 20 years ago. What was her handwriting doing on a photo taken years after that? Unless I turned it over. On the back, in faded ink, were 5 words. For her, from your mother. My breath caught. That couldn't be right. My mother knew. I searched the back of my mind for every conversation I'd ever had with her. Every time she'd mentioned Elliot with that soft, tired sigh. Maybe she had known. Maybe she'd carried the secret too. Suddenly, I remembered something. The year Elliot disappeared, our mother had fallen ill. He'd come home once, quietly, in the middle of the night. I'd found him sitting by her bedside, holding her hand. They'd talked in whispers until morning. At the time, I thought they were saying goodbye. But maybe he was confessing. I pressed the photo to my chest, my heart pounding. All those years, my mother had known, and she'd chosen silence too, just like him. For the first time, I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt human. I opened the diary again and flipped to the last page. His final was, "Forgiveness finds its way home, even if it takes a lifetime." I whispered the words out loud, my voice breaking. 2 days later, I drove back to the cemetery. The sky was clear, the air still. I brought the diary and the photograph with me. Elliot's headstone sat beneath a maple tree, the same tree we used to climb as kids. I knelt down beside it, brushing away the fallen leaves. "Hey, troublemaker," I whispered. "You didn't make it easy on me, did you?" I took a deep breath and laid the photo against the stone. "She knows now," I said softly. "Your daughter. She knows who you were." For a long while, I just sat there, talking to him. I told him about Lydia, about how she smiled when she heard his name, how she cried when she learned the truth. I told him about Claire, how she still carried his ghost. And I told him about me, how I finally understood why he'd chosen silence. Because sometimes love isn't about claiming, it's about protecting. When I stood up to leave, the wind picked up, gentle, almost tender, like a hand brushing my shoulder. I smiled. "You can rest now, Elliot," I said. "You finally came home." As I walked back to my car, the world felt lighter somehow. Not because everything made sense, but because it didn't have to anymore. Some stories don't end neatly. Some just soften over time. I looked back one last time. The maple leaves fluttered in the wind, catching sunlight like gold. And I thought of all the quiet loves in the world, the ones no one talks about, the ones that survive in silence. This story isn't just about loss or secrets. It's about love, the kind that hides itself to keep others whole. If you've ever carried a truth too heavy to speak, know this: silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it's the purest kind of strength there is. Because love isn't always what we say. Sometimes it's what we choose to keep. And that's what my brother taught me. That strength isn't loud. It's what survives when everything else breaks. There's a certain peace that only comes after you've faced everything you were afraid to. In the weeks after visiting Elliot's grave, I found myself waking up earlier. The house felt lighter. I started baking again, humming to the radio like I used to. Grief was still there, but it had softened. Less like a storm, more like rain on a faraway roof. Lydia and I kept in touch. We talked often, not about the secret, but about small things. The weather, books, her students. Every so often, she'd send me a message, thinking of him today, and I'd reply, me too. We never said much more, but we didn't need to. Some connections speak quietly, and that's enough. One afternoon, about a month after everything happened, I drove down to the coast, the place Elliot used to love. He'd always said the ocean reminded him of forgiveness. Because no matter what you pour into it, he once told me, it still keeps moving. I stood at the shoreline, watching the waves curl and break, and thought about how much we all hide from each other. The mistakes, the fears, the moments we wish we could rewrite. But maybe life isn't about rewriting. Maybe it's about learning to live with the pages that smudge. I pulled out the last photo I had of him, the one Lydia had given me, and smiled. He looked so alive in it. Not like a man carrying regret, but like someone who'd found peace in loving quietly. And then I thought of Lydia, how brave she'd been, how she'd chosen to forgive a man she never really got to call dad. That, I realized, was her inheritance. Not his name, not his blood, but his capacity to love without asking for anything back. As the sun began to set, I whispered something to the wind, something I'd been holding in for years. I forgive you, I said, and I forgive myself. Because guilt had been living rent-free in me for too long. Guilt for not asking more questions, for not seeing his pain sooner, for assuming time would wait for us to heal. But time never waits. It just moves, like the tide, washing away what no longer belongs. When I drove home that evening, I didn't feel like the same woman who'd opened that diary weeks before. I wasn't carrying secrets anymore. I was carrying lessons. And I realized something. Healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just whispers. It's okay now. That night, I sat on my porch, watching fireflies drift across the yard, and thought about how strange it is, how the people we love the most can live whole lives we never see. But maybe that's not a tragedy. Maybe it's proof that everyone has a world inside them, a private landscape of hopes, heartbreaks, and small acts of grace. Elliot's world had been full of silence, but not emptiness. His silence was love disguised as restraint, devotion wrapped in guilt. And now that I understood that, I could finally let him rest. Before I went to bed, I opened his diary one last time and wrote beneath his final line, not to answer him, but to thank him. You were right. Forgiveness found its way home. Then I closed it and placed it in my dresser drawer, beside my mother's rosary and a few letters from my youth. Not to forget, but to remember in peace. If you've listened this far, thank you. Truly, I hope my story reminds you of something simple but true. We all carry secrets, some too heavy to name. But love, the real kind, always finds a way to outlive the silence. And if you're carrying something unsaid, something that aches when the world goes quiet, maybe tonight's the night to forgive yourself too. Because strength isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go and doing it with grace.